In the spring of 1861, in the red clay country of central Georgia, a woman named Sarah committed an act so peculiar and devastating that it would be whispered about in the parlors of Milledgeville for generations, though never openly discussed, never recorded in any official ledger or family Bible. What she did to Colonel Augustus Thornwell in the final weeks of his life was not murder in the legal sense, though it killed him just as surely as poison or the rope. It was something more terrible than that. A slow unmaking, a deliberate dismantling of a man's pride and sanity, executed with such methodical patience that by the time he died, those who knew what had transpired could not decide whether to call it justice or madness or something for which the English language had no proper name. You are now watching Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slave-holding South. The tales that were buried beneath magnolia blossoms and hentel silence. The stories that reveal what human beings become when one is granted absolute power over another. This is the story of Sarah, and of what she made Colonel Thornwell do before she allowed him to die. The Thornwell plantation, known locally as Ashford Hall, sprawled across nearly 2,000 acres of Georgia cotton country, about 12 miles southeast of Milledgeville, the state capital. It was not the largest holding in the county, but it was among the most profitable, producing upward of 300 bales of prime cotton each harvest season. Colonel Thornwell, the title was honorary, a remnant of militia service in his youth, owned approximately 140 souls, men and women and children, whose bodies and labor had built his fortune, whose backs had bent to make his fields bloom white each autumn. He was 53 years old in the spring of 1861, a widower of some 7 years, his wife Abigail having died of consumption in 1854, leaving him childless and increasingly isolated in the great house that stood at the end of a long avenue of live oaks. Augustus Thornwell was known throughout the district as a man of fierce pride and rigid principle. He was educated, a graduate of the College of New Jersey, well-read in the classics, a subscriber to agricultural journals and political newspapers. He kept meticulous records of his property, both land and human, noting births and deaths, and prices and productivity with the same careful hand. He used to record the weather and the quality of the soil. He was not, by the standards of his time and place, considered cruel. He did not brand his slaves as some planters did. He did not separate mothers from small children at Sally. He maintained that a well-ordered plantation, like a well-ordered household, required discipline and hierarchy, but not brutality. He believed, as many men of his class believed, that slavery was ordained by God and beneficial to the Negro race, which he considered incapable of self-governance. He believed these things with the same certainty that he believed in the rising of the sun. Among the enslaved population at Ashford Hall, there were some who worked the fields, and some who worked the house, some who tended the livestock, and some who possessed specialized skills, carpentry, smithing, midwifery, and there was Sarah. She was 28 years old in 1861, though her exact birth date was not recorded in Colonel Thornwell's ledgers. She had been born on the plantation, the daughter of a woman named Patience, who had died in childbirth when Sarah was 12. Sarah's father was unknown, or at least unacknowledged, though there were some who claimed to see in her features a resemblance to the colonel's younger brother, who had visited Ashford Hall frequently in the 1830s before moving to Alabama. Sarah's was slender and tall, with a skin the color of polished walnut and eyes that seemed to look through things rather than at them. She worked in the house, primarily in the kitchen, though she also tended to the colonel's personal chambers, bringing his morning coffee, laying out his clothes, emptying his chamber pot. She was literate, having been taught to read by the late Mrs. Thornwell, who had maintained that a house servant should be able to read scripture and follow written instructions. This literacy, this ability to decode the marks on a page, would prove it to be one of the weapons Sarah would eventually wield. The spring of 1861 was a strange and electric time throughout the South. South Carolina had seceded from the Union in December of the previous year, followed quickly by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. War had not yet begun. Fort Sumter would not fall until April, but everyone knew it was coming. In the parlors and churches and town squares, men spoke of states' rights and honor and the necessity of preserving their way of life. On the plantations, the enslaved population watched and waited, understanding that enormous forces were in motion, but uncertain what those forces would mean for them. Some hoped for freedom, some feared chaos, most simply endured, as they had always endured. It was in early March of 1861 that Colonel Thornwell received a letter that altered the trajectory of his life and Sarah's. The letter came from a physician in Milledgeville, a Dr. Ephraim Caldwell, who had examined the colonel during a visit to town the previous month. The news was grim. The colonel was suffering from a cancer of the stomach, already advanced, inoperable. Dr. Caldwell gave him perhaps 6 months, possibly less. The pain would worsen, his appetite would fail, he would waste away. There was laudanum for the pain, but no cure. The colonel read this letter in his study, alone, and did not emerge until the following morning. He told no one about the diagnosis. He burned the letter in the fireplace and scattered the ashes with a poker. He decided that he would die as he had lived, in control, in command, with dignity intact. It would not become a spectacle. It would not be pity, but the cancer had its own timeline, and it cared nothing for Augustus Thornwell's dignity. Within weeks, the pain began in earnest, a gnawing ache that made sleep difficult and appetite impossible. He began to lose weight. His face grew gaunt. He spent more and more time in his chambers, claiming fatigue, claiming the burdens of managing the plantation in such uncertain times. And it was Sarah who attended him, Sarah who brought him broth. He could not eat, Sarah who cleaned the basin. When he wretched in the night, Sarah who saw him at his weakest and most vulnerable. Pause for a moment and reflect on this. In a system where one human being could own another absolutely, could command their labor and their bodies without restriction. What happened when that owner became weak, when the man who held all power became powerless in his own flesh? The plantation system depended on the fiction of the master's invulnerability, his godlike authority. What occurred when that fiction was revealed as precisely that, a fiction? Sarah said nothing as she tended to the colonel. She performed her duties with the same quiet efficiency she had always shown. But she was watching, she was learning. She observed how the pain unmanned him, how it made him whimper in the dark hours before dawn. She saw how he reached for the laudanum bottle with shaking hands, how he wept when he thought he was alone. She understood, with a clarity that was almost clairvoyant, that the power dynamic between them had shifted. He needed her now. He depended on her silence, her discretion, her care. And in that need, she found her opportunity. It began small. She started to control his meals more deliberately. When he complained that the soup was too salty, she apologized and brought him something blander. When he said the bread was stale, she made certain the next loaf was fresh. She presented herself as his most loyal servant, the one person in the house who truly understood his suffering. She encouraged him to confide in her, to speak of his fears, and slowly, carefully, over the course of several weeks, she gained a kind of influence over him that would have seemed impossible in any other circumstance. He began to trust her, or perhaps more accurately, he began to rely on her in a way that resembled trust. The colonel owned a horse, a magnificent bay stallion named an Imperator, 16 hands high, with a coat that gleamed like burnished copper in the sunlight. He had purchased the animal 5 years earlier from a breeder in Kentucky, paying what many considered an outrageous sum, $800, for a creature of such quality. Imperator was the colonel's pride, his most visible symbol of wealth and taste. He rode the horse to church on Sundays, to town for business, around the plantation to inspect the fields. Men admired Imperator. They asked about his bloodlines, his temperament, his speed. The horse represented everything the colonel valued: breeding, power, control, superiority. In late April, as the colonel's condition worsened and the news of Fort Sumter's fall reached Georgia, Sarah began to speak to him about food. The cancer had destroyed his appetite almost completely. The sight of meat made him nauseous. He could manage only broth, weak tea, occasionally some bread soaked in milk. He was starving, essentially, not from lack of food, but from inability to consume it. Sarah, in a role as his primary caretaker, began to tell him stories about hunger, about the enslaved people on the plantation who had worked until they collapsed, about the rations that were sometimes insufficient, about children with distended bellies and old men with bones protruding through their skin. She spoke of these things gently, almost conversationally, as she sat beside his bed at night when the laudanum made him talkative and confused. "Master," she would say, "you ever think about what it feel like to be hungry all the time? Not sick hungry like you got now, but hungry 'cause there just ain't enough. Hungry 'cause somebody else decide how much you get to eat, when you get to eat, whether you get to eat at all." The colonel, in his deteriorated state, began to respond to these questions. Sometimes he dismissed them. Sometimes he argued that his slaves were well fed by the standards of the time. But sometimes, in his delirium and pain, he seemed to consider what she was saying. The laudanum loosened his tongue. He spoke of things he had never spoken of before, his doubts, his occasional moments of unease about the system he had spent his life defending. It was in one of these conversations, in early May, that Sarah planted the seed of the idea that would consume the final weeks of the colonel's life. She had brought him broth made from chicken stock, and he had pushed it away after a single sip. She sat beside the bed, holding the bowl, and said quietly, "That horse of yours eat better than most folks on this place ever will." The colonel looked at her through rheumy eyes. "What are you saying?" "Who's saying what's true, master? Imperator get good good grain, fresh water brought to him twice a day. He got a stable cleaner than some of the cabins. He got more care than some of the children. He is a valuable animal, more valuable than a person." The colonel closed his eyes. "You overstep yourself, Sarah." But the seed was planted. Over the following days, as his pain intensified and his body continued its slow collapse, Sarah returned to the subject again and again. She spoke of the horse's diet, its comfort, the resources devoted to its care. She began to make comparisons, supple at first, then increasingly direct, between the treatment of the animal and the treatment of the human beings the colonel owned. And then, one night when the colonel was particularly distraught, wrecked with pain despite the laudanum, she made her proposal. You want to understand what you don't build here, master? What this place really is? Then you should eat what they eat. Not the slaves. They got the rations, such as they is. I mean the one you love most on this whole plantation, that horse. You should eat what he eat. You should know what it means to be valued so high and still be property. The colonel stared at her as if she had spoken in tongues. You are mad. Maybe so, Sarah said. But you dying anyway, master. You can die knowing only half the truth, or you can die knowing all of it. In a society where even love was property, where affection could be bought and sold, where the bonds between human beings were subject to the whims of commerce, perhaps madness was the only rational response. Sarah had lived her entire life understanding that she was valued less than livestock, that her worth was measured in dollars and productivity, that her children, if she had borne any, could have been taken from her and sold like calves. What she proposed to the colonel was not revenge in the conventional sense. It was education. It was a tutorial in the truth of ownership. The remarkable thing is that Colonel Thornwell agreed. Whether it was the laudanum, or the delirium of his illness, or some deep nihilistic impulse brought on by the knowledge of his impending death, he consented to Sarah's bizarre proposal. He would eat what Imperator ate. He would consume the horse's feed, the eye, the grain, the oats, as his primary sustenance. Sarah would prepare it for him, cooking the grain into a mash, grinding the eye into a fibrous paste that could be swallowed. The colonel seemed to view it as a kind of experiment, a philosophical exercise, or perhaps, in his extremity, he simply no longer cared. He was dying. Nothing he did now could change that. And so why not? Why not follow this strange black woman's suggestion into whatever revelation or absurdity awaited? Sarah began the process in mid-May. She went to the stable and collected samples of Imperator's feed, the Timothy eye, the oats, the cracked corn. She brought these materials to the kitchen house, where she worked in secret during the hours when the other house servants were occupied elsewhere. She boiled the grain until it became soft enough to eat. She chopped the eye into tiny fragments and mixed it with water to create a kind of gruel. She added salt, occasionally a bit of molasses, to make the mixture more palatable, and she brought it to the colonel 3 times a day, presenting it to him as if it were a normal meal. The colonel ate it. This is the astonishing part of the story, the detail that makes it almost unbelievable. He actually consumed it. The first few times, he managed only a spoonful or 2 before his stomach rebelled. But Sarah was patient. She encouraged him. She sat with him and spoke to him in a low, steady voice, telling him that this was necessary, that this was important, that he was finally learning something true about the world he had created. And gradually, over the course of days and then weeks, the colonel adapted. His stomach, already ruined by the cancer, seemed to accept this strange diet, no worse than it accepted anything else. He ate the mash made from horse feed. He drank water. He took his laudanum. And slowly, in a way that seemed almost supernatural, he began to change. The transformation was not physical alone, though that was striking enough. The colonel lost even more weight, his body becoming skeletal, his skin taking on a grayish pallor, his hair, which had been iron gray, seemed to turn white almost overnight. But the more profound change was psychological. He began to speak differently, to see differently. He would lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, and talk about ownership in ways that contradicted everything he had believed for 5 decades. He spoke of Imperator, of how he had loved that horse, had prided himself on the animal's magnificence, had felt a surge of satisfaction every time he rode it through town, and saw men turn to admire his mount. And now he was eating what the horse ate. He was consuming the very substance of that pride. It was, in some perverse way, a kind of communion, a ritual of understanding. "Do you see, Sarah?" he would ask, his voice weak and rasping. "Do you see what I have done? I have valued animals over people. I have loved horses and dogs more than I have loved human souls. I have been," and here he would pause, searching for words, "I have been a pharaoh. I have been a builder of pyramids on the backs of slaves." Sarah would listen to these confessions without expression. She did not absolve him. She did not comfort him. She simply continued to bring him his meals of processed horse feed, to give him water, to empty his chamber pot. She was the witness to his unraveling, the silent conductor of his peculiar penance. The household staff at Ashford Hall knew something strange was occurring, but they did not know precisely what. The colonel had withdrawn from all social interaction. He no longer received visitors. He did not attend church. He sent word to town that he was indisposed, that his overseer would handle all plantation business until further notice. The overseer, a man named Cyrus Finch, was competent enough to manage the daily operations, but he was curious about the colonel's condition. He attempted to visit the master's chambers several times, but Sarah always intercepted him, explaining that the colonel was sleeping or in too much pain to receive company, or had given orders not to be disturbed. Finch accepted these explanations at first, but as weeks passed and the colonel remained sequestered, rumors began to circulate. If you find yourself drawn to these forgotten stories, these dark chapters that reveal the true cost of the South's peculiar institution, consider subscribing to Shadows of the South. Each week, we bring you stories like this one, accounts that were deliberately suppressed, narratives that challenge our understanding of the antebellum period, testimonies to the resilience and the tragedy of those who endured America's original sin. This is history without mythology, without the comfortable lies that have obscured the truth for too long. By late May, the colonel's condition had deteriorated to the point where death seemed imminent. Dr. Caldwell, who had not been summoned to Ashford Hall since delivering his diagnosis in March, rode out to the plantation on his own initiative, concerned by reports he had heard in Milledgeville. Sarah met him at the door and initially refused him entry, claiming that the colonel had expressly forbidden any medical visits. But Caldwell, a man of considerable stubbornness and professional pride, pushed past her and made his way to the colonel's chambers. What he found there shocked him profoundly. The colonel was barely recognizable, a wasted figure in a bed that seemed far too large for his shrunken frame. The room reeked of sickness and something else, something else, something else, something else, something else, something else, an organic that Caldwell could not immediately identify. On the bedside table was a bowl containing what appeared to be some kind of grain porridge. Caldwell examined the colonel, as best he could, given the patient's weakened state, and then demanded to know what he had been eating. "Horse feed," the colonel whispered. "I have been eating what Imperator eats. Sarah has been preparing it for me." Dr. Caldwell turned to Sarah, who stood in the doorway with her arms folded. "Is this true, "You have been feeding this man horse feed." "He asked me to," Sarah said. "He wanted to understand." "Understand what?" "What it meant to be property." Caldwell was a rational man, a man of science, trained at the Medical College of Georgia. He had treated hundreds of patients, had seen death in many forms, but he had never encountered anything like this. He recognized immediately that he was witnessing something that transcended medicine, that entered the realm of psychology and morality. He attempted to explain to the colonel that this diet was hastening his death, that he needed proper nutrition, even in his compromised state. But the colonel simply shook his head. "I am already dead, Ephraim," he said. "I have been dead for years. I simply did not know it until now." Dr. Caldwell left Ashford Hall in a state of profound disturbance. He returned to Milledgeville and spoke with several other prominent citizens about what he had witnessed. These conversations took place behind closed doors, in the offices of lawyers and planters, in the private rooms of the town's elite. There was considerable debate about what, if anything, should be done. Some argued that Sarah should be arrested, charged with some crime, poisoning, perhaps, or abuse of a dependent person. Others insisted that she had only done what the colonel had asked, that she could not be held responsible for the delusions of a dying man. Still others suggested that the entire matter should be kept quiet, that it reflected poorly on the colonel and, by extension, on all of them. The decision was eventually made to do nothing. The colonel was dying anyway. Any intervention at this point would only prolong his suffering and create a scandal. Let nature take its course. Let the man die in peace, such peace as he could find. But peace was not what Colonel Augustus Thornwell found in those final days. He became increasingly agitated, increasingly voluble. He spoke constantly of ownership and property, of the souls he had kept in bondage, of the children who had been born into slavery on his land and who had no more choice about their lives than Imperator had about being a horse. He called for Sarah repeatedly, asking her questions that she sometimes answered and sometimes did not. He wanted to know if she hated him. He wanted to know if God would forgive him. He wanted to know if his late wife, Abigail, had truly known, what their wealth was built upon. Consider this, a man who had spent his entire adult life defending slavery, who had written letters to newspapers arguing for its necessity, who had preached in church about its biblical justification. This man, in his final days, came to see it for what it truly was. But this knowledge brought him no redemption, only anguish. Understanding is not absolution. Awareness is not atonement. The colonel learned the truth too late to do anything but suffer from it. On the morning of June 3rd, 1861, Sarah went to the stable and led Imperator out into the yard. Several of the field hands were nearby, preparing for the day's work, and they stopped to watch. Sarah had brought a pistol, the colonel's own pistol, taken from his desk drawer. She raised the weapon and shot the horse through the head. The great bay stallion dropped instantly, dead before his body struck the ground. Sarah stood over the animal's corpse for a moment, then returned to the house without explanation. The enslaved witnesses to this act were confused and frightened. Killing a horse worth $800 was a serious offense, but they also understood, in some unspoken way, that Sarah had moved beyond the reach of conventional punishment. She was operating according to a logic that transcended the plantation's rules. The colonel died 3 days later, on June 6th. Sarah was with him at the end. The other house servants reported that they heard him speaking in the hours before his death, though they could not make out the words. Sarah never revealed what was said in that final conversation. When the colonel's body was prepared for burial, it was discovered that he weighed less than 90 pounds. His stomach was found to contain partially decayed grain and vegetable matter, the horse feed that had been his primary sustenance for nearly a month. The horse, Imperator, was buried in a shallow grave near the stable. His magnificent body, worth $800, became food for scavengers and fertilizer for the red Georgia clay. The colonel, worth far more in the economic calculations of his society, was buried with ceremony and stone. But both man and animal returned to the earth, and in that return, the distinction between them, the distinction that had meant everything to the colonel, that had justified his entire worldview, ceased to exist. In death, they were equal. In death, ownership meant nothing. Sarah understood this. She had always understood this. And in making the colonel eat what his horse had, she was teaching him a lesson that his education at the College of New Jersey had never included, that we are all, in the end, nothing more than flesh and bone and earth, and that any system built on denying this fundamental equality is a system built on delusion and destined to collapse into dust and ruin. The South that Colonel Thornwell belonged to, the South that they had defended and believed in, did collapse. It collapsed in fire and blood, and defeat, in Sherman's March and Appomattox, in the destruction of an entire social order. And in the rubble of that collapse, people like Sarah emerged into a precarious freedom, carrying with them the knowledge of what they had survived and what they had done to survive it. Their stories, for too long suppressed or ignored, are the stories that reveal the true history of this nation. They are the stories that show us what human beings are capable of, both in their capacity for cruelty and in their capacity for resistance. They are the stories that Shadows of the South exist to tell, not because they are easy to hear, not because they make us comfortable, but because they are true, and because the truth, no matter how dark, no matter how disturbing, is what we owe to those who suffered through this history, and to ourselves as we struggle to understand how we became who we are. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think about the plantation system in a new way, if it has revealed something about human nature and their conditions of absolute power, share your reflections in the comments below. These stories deserve to be remembered, discussed, and understood. Subscribe to Shadows of the South to continue this journey into the darkest corners of American history, where we will find not comfort but truth, not heroes, but human beings pushed to the absolute limits of endurance and moral choice. This is the history that was buried beneath magnolia blossoms and moonlight and the mists of Agente El South. This is the history that demands to be heard,